Well, welcome everyone to the Great Mystery Online Salon, The Legacy of Egypt 1.0, The Art of Raising the Dead with Freddy Silva. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this wonderful presentation by Freddy. For those of you who are not already familiar with him, Freddy is one of the world's leading researchers of sacred sites, ancient systems of knowledge, and the interaction between temples and consciousness. He is well, I would like to say an expert. He's one of the foremost researchers and really knowledgeable people on crop circles. And his book, Secrets in the Field, The Science and Mysticism of Crop Circles, is excellent and inspirational. And his new book, Commonwealth, The Origin of Sacred Sites and the Rebirth of Ancient Wisdom, is also quite amazing. And although I understand it's recently been renamed, we've had the wonderful pleasure of working with Freddy for many years, both at our conferences and leading tours. And his depth of knowledge, his wisdom, and really his relationship with the land is something very unique and special. And when you're at these sacred sites with him, he somehow makes the land come alive to you in a way that I have never experienced it before. And I know he's going to be bringing that here, even though we're online rather than in a real place. But if you ever have an opportunity to join him on a tour to a sacred site, either in Egypt in January or somewhere else, I really highly recommend it. It's an experience of a lifetime. So it's my pleasure now to turn the microphone over to you, Freddy, and thank you again for being with us.
Well, thank you very much, and welcome everybody worldwide. And I hope you can hear me. I've got the microphone at full volume, or as they used to do in the old days, at full volume. So hopefully you can hear me. I have to basically admit and say that I did not plan to do this presentation and time it to coincide exactly or around about the time of Halloween. Even though, judging from the title, we obviously are going to be discussing things to do with the Halloween, but it really is not, it wasn't my intention. It's just one of those sort of subconscious things. So if you're checking in with us right now and you're expecting to see this presentation, you're going to be very, very disappointed. It has nothing to do with zombies or anything. In fact, it's actually a quite serious presentation. Because much of our present understanding of the ritual of resurrection is very much shrouded in blissful ignorance and superstition. And that's what I wanted really to get into today, because superstition is all around us. It's pretty much what happens after the original understanding of an important concept has been lost to time. And so much of our understanding of what it means to be resurrected or about the concept of raising the dead, it has been totally lost. And it would come as no surprise as well to many of you to understand that our inherited belief of resurrection pretty much revolves around a literal interpretation of the subject. And when I began to trace this understanding back to its original concept of how we ended up with the idea of, Jesus rising from the dead, or the fact that Lazarus was also rising from the dead, it really comes down to one particular apostle called Paul, who, if you read a lot of the original Essene Gospels, they described the apostle Paul as the liar. That was their nickname for him. And they very much stated that Paul, who basically was their equivalent of a second-hand car salesman, and this is very much in their interpretation, it's not my spin on things, they didn't have much regard for him for one essential thing, and that was that Paul totally misinterpreted all the teachings of the ascents. He took everything literally, and yet the idea of the scriptures as written by the Gnostic sects and other people who were working with esoteric principles at the time, the initial understanding was literal, but the true understanding of any subject had a much different layer to it. It was so that they could actually maintain the integrity of their teachings from the people who did not really want to use the teachings for their greatest benefit. So we have this scenario for the last 2,000 years where our concept of rising from the dead has been very much distorted. It then gets promulgated by the Catholic dogma, which stipulates that survival of the soul only occurs after physical death, or, as you might find out in 2 months from now, following the end of the world. And I'm only joking, of course. But the true story of the raising of the dead is actually very, very different. And its origins actually stem from Egyptian rituals. And in fact, so many of our traditions of resurrections as a general concept actually are Egyptian contexts. For example, if you take this guy, the falcon-headed god, Her-Ur, that was his real name. We know him today, of course, as Horus. Horus, of course, if you know the story, he is the one who avenges the murder of his father Osiris by overcoming his evil brother Seth. And it's a wonderful myth because basically it extols the virtues of right action, because Horus restores order to chaos. And we take this myth very much at face value, except that when you look at the name Her-Ur, it is the root of our word hero, because Horus was the hero. He basically was the person that reverted the kingdom back to the light after it fell into darkness. And from this understanding of Horus, or Her-Ur, we inherited the symbol of the eye of Horus, which then is adopted by the modern medical profession in the stylized RX symbol that is today used for prescriptions pretty much in the Western world. So here we have an example of how something very traditional to the ancients slowly metamorphoses into something that we see around us every day, and we take it totally for granted without even realizing the secret origins where it comes from. So let me see if I can just do this here. Thank you. So our understanding of the healing properties of water also originates from Egypt. In fact, it goes back to the temple of the god of wisdom called Jehuti. Some of you may know this ibis-headed god, of whom I just happen to have an example right here on my desk. Never, ever leave your desk without this wonderful-looking god, especially if you're a writer. And Jehuti, who we know today as Thoth or Hermes, he basically wrote some very, very profound things back around 6000 BC. And in his printed work, which we know today as the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, he actually describes something very important that, again, we take totally for granted. And I shall quote a passage from this book. And this is the god Jehuti describing the importance of water in healing. And I quote, "This is the property of our medicine into which the previous body of the spirits are reduced, that at first one part thereof shall tinge 10 parts of this perfect body, then 100, then 1,000, and so on, infinitely on. And by how much more often the medicine is dissolved, by so much the more it is increased in virtue." We know this today shorthand as, of course, homeopathy, the principle whereby you take a small vial of water, you impregnate it with a small piece of energy, and no matter how many times you actually magnify the dilution, the original solution retains itself, and it also is amplified in virtue many millions of times. So again, something we use every day, and once again, another Egyptian concept. There are also aspects of the Egyptian temple culture which also survive with us. For example, any of you who are into the Christian ethos, you will begin your prayers with Amun, 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 who resides in heaven, otherwise known today as the Our Father. So we also close our prayers in the Western world with the word Amen, which of course is a variation of the Egyptian god of creation called Amun. So another very old concept taken for granted. As is the book of Proverbs, which is usually attributed to Solomon from Jerusalem, except that Solomon didn't actually write the book of Proverbs. It actually comes from the wisdom of Ptah-hotep, which precedes Solomon by at least 2,000 years. Whoopsie. As do the Ten Commandments. We tend to attribute the Ten Commandments to Moses, but if you look very carefully at the pharaonic confessions of spell number 125 in the Egyptian book of Coming Forth by Light, Some of you may know this as the Egyptian Book of the Dead. It states quite clearly, I have not killed, I have not stolen, I have not told lies, and so forth. Except that back in the days of when this was written, there were actually 39 commandments, not just 10. In fact, by the 14th century BC, all of these commandments, which were really written for the accurate pursuit of life, they're already old hat. I mean, people already knew these off by heart. Now, it's interesting that Moses himself was an initiate of the temple, and his name is also Egyptian by nature. Moses actually means born of, and you'll find the same epithet given to so many other pharaohs as well. For example, Tuthmosis, the fourth, is one of them. And if you look closely at Christianization of the Moses myth, you look at how he always holds up these two tablets with the laws of God inscribed on them. If you look very carefully at the shape of those tablets and then look at the actual headdress of the god Amun that you can see in front of you, there's a wonderful resemblance between the two, isn't there? So here we have the god Amun with the two tablets of wisdom rising out of his head, inscribed with all the laws of creation, and suddenly, many thousands of years later, you have the same laws written on two tablets held aloft by Moses. So again, nothing new under the sun, it seems. But perhaps esoteric Egypt's biggest contribution is the secret ritual of raising the dead. And that's what I want to focus on today. If you go back to Egypt many, many moons ago, it was a land called Kemet. And the name originally morphs into the Arabic name Al-Chem, from which we get our modern name, alchemy. So to practice alchemy, literally, is to know matter that comes from Egypt. And it has absolutely nothing to do with changing base metal into gold. It has all to do with the science of overcoming ignorance. It's the process of taking on knowledge of a specific nature, of a very sacred nature, whereby you are raised from your base animal nature and you slowly develop your spiritual nature. And for such a transformation to actually take place, what happens is that the soul of the individual requires awakening. The Egyptians considered the soul to be imprisoned in a material body, so much so that the typical person lives life pretty much unaware of the bigger picture or of the purpose of the true nature of living and why it's important to be down here in the physical body, which I'm sure all of us will totally disagree with, wondering why on earth are we down here with all of these problems? Well, there's a reason. But to the Egyptians, for a person who actually was not actually aware, totally self-aware, they would actually be considered as the walking dead, literally. But what they also noted was that a change takes place when a person becomes immersed in something that they always refer to as the knowledge. And this knowledge was taught in mystery schools throughout ancient Egypt and throughout other parts of the world. And what happened when you immersed yourself into the mystery schools is that these teachings made you conscious of something else. They made you much more aware and awake of something else that was happening beyond your own physical limitations. And they very much described that when you actually immersed yourself in these processes, that a change took place. You were literally transformed into gold. In fact, they had a wonderful phrase for it. You came to shine as a bright star. You became as the heavens. And at that moment, the Egyptians claimed that when you reached this point of initiation, that you became raised from the dead. And that's where we get our first idea that perhaps our literal interpretation and their original understanding are very, very different. So we've come to know about the knowledge and the Egyptian mysteries and the ritual of resurrection because it pretty much survived mostly intact in later Gnostic traditions throughout the Near East. And the traditions survived with sects such as the Sabians, who were a very, very large sect around the time of Jesus and before that, all throughout the Middle East and all the way down to Ethiopia. We had a sect called the Nazarites, which some of you may know as the Nazareans as well. Same people, but particularly the Essene culture, which gets a lot of mention around the time of Jesus. And something very mysterious happened in 1947 when scientists, actually no, there was two goat herders who basically walked into this cave that you can see in front of you in the middle of the Dead Sea. They came across some copper scrolls. And these copper scrolls were basically buried in these caves at Qumran. It was found that they were written by the Ascend community that originated from Jerusalem and eventually moved out to the Dead Sea area as a result of the Roman invasion. So we are told in these very important copper scrolls that the immersion in the mysteries and the raising of the dead was very much conducted in secret chambers on Temple Mount in Jerusalem. One of the most important buildings described in the inner temple court was the House of Tribute, and its entrance was still known in the 1st century BC as the Gate of Offering. And it stood on a stone platform, each of its 4 corners bearing a small chamber, one of which was the chamber of the hearth. Now, inset into its stone floor, and this is an actual drawing of some of the excavations that were done in the 19th century under Jerusalem. On the floor of this temple was a marble slab that could be raised by a fixed metal ring, and it revealed an opening into a deep cavern below. Then there was an adjacent chamber. There was a flight of stairs named the Staircase of Refuge, and it led to an underground passageway and into the chamber of immersion. And this is where the rituals, such as the raising of the dead, were said to be performed. They literally are sitting under Temple Mount today. They're about 80 feet below the present floor level. And in the 19th century, there was a group of British archaeologists that went there and found all of these passages. So this is an original diagram I'm actually showing you right here. It's amazing what my local librarian can do. I've put her through so many hoops, it's unbelievable. Poor woman. Now, the funny thing is that these practices that were written about in the copper scrolls written by the Ascends are actually validated by earlier scriptures, because if you read the book of Ezekiel, it literally describes how the elders of Jerusalem, and I quote, engaged in secret mysteries of Egyptian provenance, and they did so in darkness under the Temple of Solomon. And the resurrection ceremonies performed by the Ascends many thousands of years later, and other sects as well, were themselves a continuation of rituals which were handed down 1,500 years earlier, before that, from the traditions of a pharaoh by the name of Sekenenre Tau. And he performed these same principles in initiation chambers in Luxor. Now, these things that the Sekenenre Tau actually performed, these initiation practices, themselves stem from identical ceremonies going back 4,000 years before his time. So you can see how the time scale is enormous and at some points almost beyond comprehension. And at the time, there appears to this concept of the initiates as the living. And they were described as being very separate from everyone else outside a specific sect, whom they refer to as the dead. So we're talking about an era of about 1500 BC, where you have initiates of the temple who go by one name, and the people who are outside of this specific group are called the dead, sometimes the walking dead. There was one very famous practitioner that later continued this ritual that was being done in Luxor around about 1500 BC. And of course, his name, we all know, was a man called Jesus, even though that wasn't his real name. It's his Greek name. And Jesus, as a man who was himself initiated into the mysteries of the Essenes, he actually maintained a 2-tier structure where he actually offered simple teachings to the many, but he gave a secret teaching to the few. And if you know your Bible quotations very well, you will see that he actually describes in the Bible, and I quote, "Unto you it is given to know the mysteries of the kingdom of God. But unto them that are without, all of these things are done in parables." So now we know there's definitely 2 sides of the same information being dispersed to 2 different people. But whenever Jesus actually initiated a new candidate into his inner group, which is called the few, they were said to be raised from the dead. So this guy, Jesus, is continuing a very, very old tradition. So if you compare these practices that Jesus was doing with what was going on in remote times in Egypt, there are major similarities. If you go back to the Temple of Edfu in Egypt, there exists a description written on the wall of a ritual that brings people in from the dead. And they call it raising or standing up. And there's one lovely passage that's written on there that's in hieroglyphs, and it says very clearly how the initiates at the Temple of Edfu were requested to stand up with the Ahau. And I always wanted to know who were the Ahau, and why were they standing up? Was it a matter of respect when these Ahau walk into the room? Did the initiates have to also stand up like we sometimes have to do at school, or used to in my day anyway? Otherwise you'd be placed in a very dark cupboard for the rest of the day. In no way did I go to Catholic school, but I'll forget about that one. And I discovered that the Ahau was basically a nickname for the people who were actually the teachers of the temple at this time. And they were described officially as builder gods. This was a group of very, very tall people, measuring about 15 foot in height. And they actually list the actual dimensions of these people on the temple walls. It's an incredible inscription. These builder gods survived the great catastrophe of the flood about 9000 BC, and they became the caretakers of the knowledge that was transmitted to a very select few in the temple. And this is what they kept referring to as the knowledge. There was a secret initiation ceremony that was involved with all of this, and these practices were apparently conducted in subterranean chambers as well. And here's one of them, very famous one. In fact, one of the few that still remains, the initiation chambers that still exist in Egypt, because as some of you already know, a lot of the Egyptian temples were built on many, many layers of underground temples, which are now, of course, buried by the Nile mud. So if you go to the Temple of Dendera, as we shall be doing in January, there is a narrow, very claustrophobic chamber decorated with one-of-a-kind reliefs which actually depict what appears to be a kind of rebirthing scene. And it's a very unusual glyph. It's almost like you're watching two cathode ray tubes, like the Egyptians had developed early television sets. They're nothing like you'll ever see anywhere else in Egypt. And with the lotus flower at the base, connecting these tubes and these snakes, these serpents, which are always analogous of earth energy, inside these tubes, it's very much taken by some of the alternative historians, such as myself, that we are looking here at a kind of metaphor for rebirthing. And it is very highly likely that this ceremony at Dendera was first conducted above the ground in the main temple, which again was rebuilt in the modern era, where the initiate was briefed on the remaining aspects of the knowledge. And then, as nighttime approached, the initiate was led into this underground chamber where he or she would spend the night inside a cave-like room, as if you're actually figuratively immersed into the actual womb of the earth. So you were there all night, very quietly, hoping there wasn't a couple of snakes down there with you. And then luckily you emerged at dawn from this underground world and from the underworld as a fully initiated adept of the mysteries, right in time to greet the rising sun. Not a bad way to spend an evening. So this is how they basically did the procession of rising from the dead. The candidate literally rose from the underworld. They rose from the dead, and they now saw the world through very, very different eyes, because that was the close of many years of work. Just to the west of Dendera, there is a much older chapel, and it's the Chapel of Osiris. And this is in the Temple of Abydos. And it contains a wonderful mural which actually depicts the actual ceremony of rebirthing and raising the dead in very graphic terms, as long as, of course, you understand the symbology. And in this mural, the candidate is led by Osiris, who is the keeper of the gate into paradise, and he emerges at the end of the ceremony with his body spiritualized in the form of the god Horus, who, as we know earlier, he basically reenacted the scene of his father's death. He overcame his father's death, and he came to rise like a star in the sky. Now, adjacent to this building is one of the greatest underground chambers still remaining in the world. And when I'm talking, of course, about the Osirian, it's quite something. Access nowadays is very difficult inside it, although you can get quite close up. You can just see to the left there, an actual gantry. You can get right up to the actual water. the Nile is now seeping through it, so you can't actually access the inside chambers. But the size of these rocks, if you haven't been here, you will not believe this. I mean, some of these rocks are over 400 tons in weight, some of the biggest rocks on Earth. And I always joke to people that the more cyclopean the rocks that are used in temples in Egypt, the older the temple. It seems we seem to get down to sort of mud bricks the later we actually develop these temples. So it makes you wonder how they were doing this stuff. This temple, once it was underground, as you can see from the rocks all the way around it, it's about 12,000 years old, and pretty much it's certain that the mysteries of birth and rebirth were taught and conducted here. And you can see on the bottom left-hand corner, there are engravings of the flower of life flashed, burned into one of the actual stones. Complete mystery of how this diagram got there, or how they even would burn this into one of the hardest rocks on Earth. And but you can see quite clearly that this diagram is the flower of life. It contains essentially the genetic code and the secret of creation in stylized form. And for those of you who are paying real attention, it's amazing how quickly your coffee gets cold. Wow. This is why I need a girlfriend. I need someone to come and make me hot coffee. You can see, for those of you who are paying close attention, you can see how the Kabbalah, the diagram of the Kabbalah, neatly nestles inside that diagram of the flower of life. If you pick that word apart, Kabbalah, in Arabic, it means the spirit and body of God. So you can see how the Kabbalah, which emanates from the secret diagram of the flower of life, is essentially a blueprint of how life essentially is put together. So they're pretty clever people when they did this. You just have to basically pick this information apart. There exists a curious link actually between this temple, the Osirian, and that other ritual chamber I talked about earlier under Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And this chamber, it was rediscovered by the Knights Templar around 1120 AD. And here again is another wonderful diagram, sort of this, drawn by the archaeologists that went in under Temple Mount in, I believe it was 1864. And so these are original 19th century drawings of the excavations. There's an entire city under Temple Mount. And the Templars' biggest secret revolved around a secret ritual as well. And when you look at this transcripts from tortured Templars, they described it as, and I quote, a law so extraordinary on which such a secret should be kept. And it was said to be an initiation that led to total self-empowerment. And initiates into the Templar order described the experience as coming in to the joys of paradise. And it's one of those phrasings that kept me going for many, many years while I was writing the new book that just came out last week on the Templars, which I know some of you already have. Thank you. And it's one of the reasons why I sort of came back to this concept of raising the dead, because the Templars seem to have picked up on this. Because it seemed to me that the wording by candidates joining the Templar fraternity was implying an experience that liberated them from material entrapment by means of a spiritual transfiguration. So the emerging conclusion is that the secret of the Templars ultimately revolved around a revealed knowledge through a ritual whose experience led to personal revelation. So according to insinuations in sacred scrolls, esoteric books, and even the sacred buildings themselves, this was apparently achievable through a knowledge revealed to a very select few via the mysteries, as well as the practical application of certain natural laws. So what did this have to do with the Osirian in Egypt? Well, let me show you. And here's a diagram from First Templar Nation. Anything for a plug. If we actually plot the prime Templar locations in Jerusalem, they are, of course, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is the reason why they all went to Jerusalem in the first place, under the guise of the Crusade. The second one, of course, is Solomon's Stables, which the Templars were very adamant that they wanted to go and live in, and they eventually did reside in, and that's where they began to basically carve their tunnels under Temple Mount. And the third place, which not many people know, is the Abbey of Notre Dame du Mont de Sion. or the Abbey of Mount Sion, which is home to a secret order of monks named the Order of Sion, who essentially breathed life into the Templar movement. In fact, they pretty much bankrolled them. So these three sites, as you can see, form a perfect, and I mean perfect, isosceles triangle. It's a figurative Holy Trinity, and even forms what you can see as the tip of a pyramid. So being the curious person that I am, I couldn't help but bisect that triangle, and I mean very, very accurately. And when this triangle is bisected, the imaginary line extends all the way into that Osirian back in Egypt. It's about 800 miles away. These things don't happen by chance. These are very, very well-designed connections. And now that we know that the Templars were onto a secret that they stumbled upon in scrolls under Temple Mount that were written by the Essenes about the processes of raising the dead and initiation into the principles of resurrection, and it connects the principles back to Egypt, you begin to appreciate how this story, again, is promulgated from time after time after time, again and again. So, not surprisingly, the tradition of using initiation chambers for the practice of the Chthonic mysteries even continued throughout Europe via the Templars right up to medieval times. In fact, it is quite common to find them beneath Celtic Christian churches and Gnostic cathedrals throughout Europe, most of which were erected above pre-existing ancient temples to begin with, where identical rituals were earlier performed by Druids and other Gnostic sects throughout Europe. You'll know some of these sites. This is from a church in Spain called Santa Cruz. Literally, you can go and actually go into the church and you look into under the floor. There's a hole in the church floor, and there's an entire initiation chamber made of Neolithic stones right under there. You'll know some of these sites because they are named Chartres Cathedral. There's an old Druidic chamber under the crypt, which is probably on top of a Neolithic mound. Mont Saint-Michel, where I should be going to with another group in May as well. That also sits on an old chamber as well, and so forth. I could be here all day just talking about these places. So this is this concept of initiating yourself into the secrets of the mysteries to lead yourself and your soul for a rebirthing, a resurrection, is something that is very, very old. It's not something that's new, as I said at the beginning. It's something that's been promulgated again and again, but its original concept somehow has been lost along the way. Now, most of you are familiar with my concept of the concept of sheep taking over the world. I'm slowly having to remodify my theory that I think the meerkats are actually responsible for taking over the world. I'm not sure yet. I don't have all the proof in, but they look very odd. And I think we ought to be suspicious of these people. It's a work in progress. Now, naturally, for a neophyte to experience resurrection, they were required to undergo a process of initiation. And it was a privilege open to only a select few. The candidate first underwent a period of observation for 1 year. And this was done very deliberately. It was to gauge their level of trust. Can we trust the initiate? Can they be responsible to actually take on these secret mysteries and maintain their integrity, despite the fact that they might get killed for this kind of knowledge? So during this period of observation, the initiates were given general instructions. They were given certain truths, and these truths were often sort of hidden within parables to make sure that you would run away with this information before your time of initiation came upon you. But upon successfully completing this trial period, the candidate was then admitted into an inner group, and initiation into the fuller mysteries then ensued. And in ancient Egypt, there is this recurring theme of members of the pharaoh's households being favored to join just such an inner circle, in which they were said to master secret things of the king. So, what were they talking about? Well, there exist these wonderful inscriptions on what are called false doors on temples. This is a picture of a false door. Basically, it's It's a symbolic gateway into the other world. Anybody who's been to Stonehenge has experienced this, because the trilithons holding up those big stones, the gap in between those two uprights, that is the spirit pathway. That's where the spirit comes through the stones into the stone circle. This is the Egyptian counterpart, which preceded that understanding. And in one of these false doors, there's this wonderful description where it is described, it describes the surprise by one of these individuals in a pharaoh's court who was totally honored to be admitted to this inner group of the pharaoh Teti. And I'll read this description out from you. It was translated recently. So you've got this guy who basically works for Pharaoh Teti, and he says, "Today, in the presence of the son of Ra, Teti, more honored by the king than any servant, as master of secret things of every work which his majesty should be done. When his majesty favored me, his majesty caused that I enter the chamber of restricted access." There you are, right from the horse's mouth. Well, this very lucky individual then joyfully proclaims that at the end of the ritual, I quote, "I found the way." Now, what did he find? Because the exact same expression was later adopted by the Essenes and the Jerusalem Church of the early Christians, whose initiates are referred to as those of the way, as well as the children of the light. So obviously, this initiation suddenly transformed these people into very different people. Now, initiation, what it means is to become conscious. And I hope you guys like the way I've redone my living room. Is this really good or what? We live well in Maine. I mean, I might live in a small apartment, but look what you get for $900 a month. You get an entire Egyptian temple in the living room, including your own sarcophagus. So, initiation means to become conscious. And it's a very important process. It serves to guide higher, more penetrating frequencies into your physical body. Because your physical body operates at a very low vibration compared to the rest of the universe. Okay, we're very dense people. And I'm talking about carnally, not mentally. So in order to guide these higher frequencies into your body and get you attuned to a different level of frequency, the process of initiation was done in stages. And it was necessary because it prevented the nerve centers and other electrical circuits in your body from burning out. Makes a lot of sense. And the instruction was even conducted from temple to temple, and each step slowly raised the vibration of the initiate. Everything was done very calculated, very slowly. The reason was that out-of-body experiences can be very, very dangerous. People have actually died in the Great Pyramid doing silly things in what they call the sarcophagus, and I'll come to that later. So this experience was given only to the very practiced and the very initiated, who understood total control of the body's electrical field and were allowed to advance onto the next stages and preparation into the process of initiation. But the process also requires greater resistance to physical impulses, particularly the control of emotion. We take emotion very much for granted. Emotion, what it means is energy in motion. And it's one thing that separates the soul world from the physical world. And one thing that the spirit world, when you actually connect with them, is the one thing that they are totally envious of us as humans. That might come as a great surprise and as a great comfort to know that not only are we down here for a good reason, but the spirit world actually envies us. How cool is that? And the reason is because in the spirit world, there is no emotion. Everything is a collective. Emotion is something that is very much inherent in the human body. And it's something that's very palpable because as physical beings, we feel emotion on a very physical, very palpable level. That's something that's very missing in the spirit world, according to scriptures and also to how should I describe this? It's a lot of psychic information from people who actually are very trustworthy with their information. So to control your emotions is very, very important, because if you get it right, if you're not no longer subjected to your emotions, you are able to perceive the world as a carnate being, but you are not totally held hostage to emotions of either enormous elation or total degradation. For example, if your girlfriend walks out on you and you love her dearly, or your boyfriend, you basically feel terrible for months on end. Well, your emotions now have total control of your body. It's not going to do you any good. The trick is to basically overcome that, so you can basically walk that fine line through the world and appreciate emotions for what they are. They're just feelings. Not to walk like a robot through life, but be able to be aware that these emotions exist, and some create great happiness, some create great sadness. If you're in total control of this and you get it right, what happens is that you've achieved a greater degree of self-consciousness. You become self-aware. And you do that over the course of 20 years during your process of initiation, and you become not just omnipotent, but you become omniscient. And that is not bad for 20 years of education, because that's how long it took in the old days from your process that you entered the mystery schools. You took that 1 year of observation. If you got it right, they allow you into the inner group. And then for the next 19 years, unless you were a very, very good learner, you would actually take 20 years to achieve all of these controls over the physical world. And you basically be able to be in and out of your body at will. Not bad. But the final process for this initiation required an overnight stay inside an underground chamber, as we've already found out. And the initiate would be given a kind of narcotic. Stop that giggling, not that kind of narcotic, because this narcotic induced a kind of shamanic state. It was something that just helped you get out of your head a little bit easier. And when you're inside these underground chambers in this initiatory state, eventually it would lead you to an out-of-body experience throughout the night. You're able to maintain this total connection out of your brain throughout the entire process of the night. Almost like you're in a total dream state where you are totally in control of where your soul is going. And then, of course, at dawn, the initiate was helped out of the chamber in time to meet the morning star. And that's the moment that literally you were risen from the dead. So that's what they were talking about whenever they mentioned that particular phrase. And it's very interesting because the hieroglyph for morning star, and here it is, has the literal meaning divine knowledge, or more accurately, is the hieroglyph for knowledge of the true laws of nature. So now you get an idea of what it meant to actually be initiated into the mysteries and to the knowledge. Suddenly you were able to not only experience your light body for what it is, and you became aware that there's a light body and a incarnate body, but suddenly you became aware of the bigger mysteries of life. And when you actually reconnect with what they describe as the knowledge, and your soul connected with the source of everything, hopefully you'd know how to come back into the body and return into the body with major insights. So that is the trick of what it means to do proper initiation. It's not just to have a little whoopee outside of the body and connect with all kinds of dead relatives and your cat that passed away a year ago. It was basically to bring back insights. You go in prepared, and you actually take in information, you gather information, you make sure the questions you are posing yourself were actually very structured in your mind before you underwent this process, and when you got your information, you'd bring it all back. So that's one of the processes that actually took place in these chambers. And here's another resurrection ritual that was performed in another chamber. They actually describe this entire process at the Pyramid of Unas, which is actually in Saqqara, in Egypt. And the ritual was typically conducted on the last night of the waning moon, beginning at sunset, and continued all night into sunrise. So again, with having something here that, how should I say it continues again even throughout ancient Egypt for at least 2,000 years. The same process gets carried on for a few thousand years. And in this particular chamber, they actually describe how there appear to have been admission ceremonies for new members all the time, when they were figuratively resurrected and admitted into the secrets and the mysteries which were handed down verbally since the time of the gods. So obviously, such secrets would, by definition, require a secret society, a privileged group that constituted a society apart. So we tend to focus so much on sort of secret societies as being inherently evil because they're trying to hide something. If we just shift our focus a little bit and accept that some of these secret societies kept information secret because they're trying to protect something of great importance, then we begin to shift that understanding that the idea was that they would only let people in if you're responsible with this information. Because as you can see, information of this kind of priority can actually lead you not just to be very powerful if you abuse it, but also you can develop an enormous ego, and then you use this information to control other people, and that's not what it was about. So such a group, such a secret group, would have had a ceremony of entry, much like any modern institution has a graduation ceremony. And this is where we get so many of our initiation ceremonies for secret societies, such as the Masons, for example, and why sometimes there's such a misunderstanding of why these things are there. And these experiences really can lead to revelation. I always try and talk from a personal point of experience as much as I possibly can. And a few of you are familiar with my experience in the Great Pyramid. I wrote about this in Commonwealth, which is now renamed The Divine Blueprint. It's a long story. I won't even go into it. I'll have to say that most people thought that the book was about the Commonwealth of Virginia, and it's not. It's The Divine Blueprint seems to be a much better title for the book. But anyway, in this book, I actually describe a personal experience that happened to me when I went into the Great Pyramid, not expecting anything to happen, which always makes the experience so much more worthwhile when it catches you by surprise. And here we are in the King's Chamber. You have that great big sarcophagus, as they call it, in the middle of the chamber. It's a wonderful resonant chamber. And you can drop a pin in here and it reverberates to a great degree. In fact, the images that you see on the left are actually sound images. They were made by my good friend John Reed. If you're into sound work and visualizing sound, he is one man to look at. He filled the sarcophagus with water. He found the resonant frequency of that sarcophagus, and these are the sound images that came back reflected from that water. They're quite beautiful. And to briefly describe my experience in here, I was here with a group. We're a close group of people in England who go about sacred sites, cleaning things up, sometimes doing ceremonies, sometimes adding energy, sometimes removing bad energy, but doing it very quietly. We try not to attract attention. We're not into that kind of thing. And 4 of us actually managed to get into the building. We were enabled to secure private access for some unusual reasons, political reasons at the time. So we had to go into the Great Pyramid with hundreds of other people. And if you've been there, you'll understand how noisy it can get. So 4 out of the 20 people managed to get in. And we get into the King's Chamber. And suddenly, all people in the rest of the building left. And we're all looking at each other. There were 4 guys. There was myself, 6'5", 4 other people who were actually in different layers of height, all the way down to 5'2". And we looked at each other and said, well, this is pretty rare. Maybe we should just sort of sit here and actually do a little bit of resonating, a little toning, and let's just tune into the building and put some energy in here, cleanse things out, and as we were taught to do, and just honor the spirit of the building for what it is. And at that moment, all the lights inside the Great Pyramid went off. Now, you've got this great big building, millions of tons of rock, and you're basically encased in this very claustrophobic environment. It's totally dark, and there are the most incredible sounds coming out of all our throats. I have never been able to actually work out what I was actually toning. I've never been able to do it since. And in the darkness with 3 of my friends, the sound is swirling around and around. There's this beautiful, beautiful toning. And at that moment, in complete darkness, and I've got a slide for this, which I made up. It's not actually what happened, because we're in complete darkness, but I'll just put you into the mood. There are these 4 grown-ups in the middle of the King's Chamber, and suddenly this whole circle of people, very, very tall people, dressed in white, it looks like a kind of a shimmering satin, emerged from the actual stones to the point where I have my eyes open. It's totally dark, and I can see these people. I can even draw them if I had a piece of paper. And they're looking at me, and I'm looking back at them, and it's the most wonderful feeling of total unconditional love I've ever felt, possibly the first time in my life. And it was moving. We just kept doing it. We didn't see each other, total darkness, and I'm looking at this whole circle of people in white, and still toning. The sound is getting hallucinogenic. It was just, you felt your body just lift off the ground. And then, this slowly melted back into the stone, and I thought, wow, that was interesting. And then each one of us took turns going into the actual sarcophagus. Again, feeling our way around in the dark. We'd sort of send commands to each other, taking turns. And I think we took about 5 minutes each because we felt that we were pushing our luck by this time. You really should be doing this in the Great Pyramid, especially in the dark, unless you pay about $5,000 in baksheesh, and we hadn't. None of this was actually organized. So 3 of us are toning, 1 man's in the chamber. Then it came my turn, and I went into the sarcophagus, and I was a little apprehensive because being very tall, I probably figured I wouldn't fit. But as soon as I laid down, it was extraordinary. The flat of my feet touched the bottom of the sarcophagus. The flat of my skull touched the top. The width of my shoulders was exactly the width of the sarcophagus, as though it was actually tailor-made for me. And I felt very happy about it. I even remember thinking, I get home, I'm going to have a bed made out exactly to these measurements, just to repeat the experience. So anyway, 4 of us took our turn, and suddenly the lights come on. There's a very annoyed Arab gentleman at the base of the pyramid shouting all the way up the great chamber, something. And we came out of there totally dazed. The Arab guard was raising his finger at us and doing this, and we just sort of said, thank you very much, and here's a little baksheesh, and he was very happy. And we walked back, dazed and confused, back to the bus where the rest of the group was waiting. And you could see that these 4 grown-ups wanted to say something to each other, and we were struggling to say. So I thought, okay, let me break the ice here. And I said to my other friend, did you see what I saw? And he said, you mean all of those people dressed in white came out of the stone who surrounded us? And I said, you saw that? Yes, it was like clear as daylight. And all the other 2 guys were also nodding their heads. Now, the chances of 4 people having the same experience in total darkness without planning is, I can say, very, very rare. So suddenly we had that validation that the experience was shared, it was valid. We obviously hit on a certain frequency in the chamber, and something happened. We had a reconnection. We had a certain initiatory experience. But the funny thing is that all 4 people claimed that each one of us went into the sarcophagus, and it was purpose-made for each one of us. And we have a guy who's 5'2", 5'6", 6 foot tall, and 6'5". Now, you explain that to me, because to this day, I can't understand how stone can literally move and liquefy itself to your dimensions. So in that moment, we had a direct experience, a physical experience of what it would be like to do the initiation ceremony as it was done back in ancient times. It was a total privilege, changed my life, obviously. But the funny thing is, when I was writing this experience for Commonwealth / the Divine Blueprint book, I went to my library here in my house, and you know how you buy books and you keep them for a while, you don't read them, and then one day you're compelled to go to your library and go, let's see if I have something here where someone also had this experience, because it's so much better when someone else actually validates your experience. So there was a book by a man called Paul Brunton, who was himself discouraged with the Victorian era, an Englishman. He went walkabout, gave away all his worldly possessions, and he went to Egypt on one of his journeys, and I pulled out this book that I've never read, and looked up the index, and he actually spent some time in the Great Pyramid too. And what happened to him? He describes exactly the same experience that I had experienced with my friends 85 years later. He even described the beings that came out of the actual stone walls. He describes them in the exact height, the exact proportions, and also the same shimmering white satin. And because he spent the whole night there, he also was taken into other chambers. And he also recollects suddenly just waking up as though the experience had been both metaphysical and material at the same time. So suddenly we had a complete unknown person who had exactly the same experience by taking in the same intent into the building. Could not believe this. Napoleon as well was said to also have had a very similar experience in the 1800s, and he kept the secret to his grave. I remember him telling the story of how when he left the building at the crack of dawn, the guards opened up the Great Pyramid, and Napoleon ran out of the building like a wild banshee. I mean, he was white as a ghost, like he'd seen something. And excuse me. And right up to his deathbed, he forbade anyone to actually ask him what had happened in the Great Pyramid. And I was reading some of the memoirs around the time of his death, and I remember this particular quote that said that his best friend came up to him at the time of his death, and he leans over, Napoleon leans over, pulls him close to him as he's about to confide the greatest secret to his friend. And he says, and his friend says, "So what happened in the Great Pyramid?" And Napoleon looks at him, and he's about to tell him, and he goes, "Oh, what's the point? You'll never believe me anyway." And then he dies. So we won't know. But I can guarantee you it was something that Paul Brunton and my three friends and I also experienced. So, yeah, you can't make this stuff up. And this is what we looked like after we came out of the Great Pyramid. You can't take it too seriously all the time. Beware of meerkats. So, we can begin to see why the Gnostic and esoteric schools placed such an importance on experiencing resurrection while still alive. That's the big difference between our understanding today in the Catholic Christian era and what they meant by resurrection back in those days. You had to do it while you were still in the body. And the process could be described as magic, and yet the entire experience that awakens the individual and helps them reconnect to their source is very much the result of a carefully designed and applied spiritual science. And this science, of course, was called the temple, or as they did back in Egypt, they called it the house of God, or the house of Osiris. And what I mean by that is that every sacred place was designed deliberately to remind you that you are much more than the sum of your parts. And for this experience to be possible, the resonance of the stone temple and the human temple have to match. And in ancient Egypt, the temple was considered a living being, not as we sometimes appreciate it, like this man walking the halls of Karnak. It wasn't just physical. The place was actually living. It was alive. It was a material expression of a god. So much so that each part of the temple was even greeted every dawn by orations from the priests as though they were actually awaking a real person from sleep. So it's not surprising then that every temple has its own voice as well, its resonance. And the resonance is carried in the name of the building's presiding deity. In Egypt, of course, the creator god Ptah is the protector of sacred spaces. Well, why? Because it is Ptah who forms the earth by uttering the divine word. In other words, Ptah utters a resonance, and upon that resonance, life is created. So Ptah, or this foundation stone, became it was repeated 1,000 years later with the Christianized St. Peter, who, as you know, is the rock on which my church is built. So said Jesus. And Peter, of course, is the Christianization of the word Ptah. So again, we have a reenactment of a very ancient Egyptian process right up to the Christian era. But of interest here is Ptah's forked stick. Let's take a close look at that stick. Here it is. It's called a was, which almost sounds like Polish. It doesn't use any vowels because vowels were sacred. Was literally means power, and it's the god's rod of power. Now, the Egyptians worked in metaphors. They liked metaphors and symbols. So these things have to be read with and understood in multiple meanings. So on one level, this wonderful rod of power is very similar to the kind of stick that was used by serpent catchers, still is to this day. But on the same level, it's also, on a metaphorical level, it is also a stick that harnesses the magnetic lines of the Earth's energy, because the serpent is always representative of the Earth's telluric currents that flow along and also through the Earth itself. On a second level, it is also a tuning fork, okay? And it's very appropriate since Ptah created the Earth using sound, used the sound of his own voice. So his stick becomes very emblematic of the importance of sound as a creative force. And this stick was also used in healing ceremonies throughout the Egyptian temples. What they did was they made these sticks out of an alloy. You'll be able to see some of these actually in the Egyptian museum in Cairo if you get to come with us in January. Each stick was actually tuned to a specific note, and when the temple healers used to work in those days, they were able to gauge your frequency. So you go into the temple, and you are a set of resonances in your body, something that's actually been discovered today in science. So the priests back then could actually listen to you and say, you're missing the frequency R. That's what's wrong with you. Not because you've got a headache or because your liver's wrong with you or something. There's a certain frequency that's actually missing in your body. So they used to choose the right stick. They used to get you to stand up. They placed the right tone stick next to your spine, and they used to tap it several times. So they would issue a certain note, and that note would transfer up and down the spine where so many of your body's electrical circuits are based, and then that frequency would tune the rest of your body. So that's how they basically work with these things in the temples. And likewise, it wasn't just the temple that had its own voice. It was also the human temple as a vessel of many resonances that had its own voice too. And in order for the living temple to open itself to you, your resonance had to match the temple's. Still happens today. And this is where the importance of sound comes into play. Because in earlier times, the choice of your name was very carefully considered by your parents. Because back in those days, they considered the soul as being very important. Your body was just a physical carrier for your soul. So your name had to be carefully considered at the time of birth because it was an expression of your resonance. The name carried the expression of your soul. So when you name your child Tutankhamun, you are calling your child the image eternal of God, literally. So it was very, very carefully considered because before you entered a temple, you had to declare your voice. You had to declare your tone. So before you walked in, you declared yourself, and that's what activated the process of atonement, or to be more precise, at one meant, because you were supposed to become at one with the physical temple. The two of you had to establish a sympathetic resonance between yourselves, and once that recognition took place between the two of you, the temple acknowledged your being, and the resonance of the building began to amplify your own. And that's what began the shamanic process. They actually described it in some of the temple walls as transforming you into a god, into a bright star, because they wanted to remind you that you were a very special person. You weren't just a peon down here on the earth. You were created in the mirror image of the gods. So they wanted to do this deliberately. And so the approach to the temple played a vital role in preparing your body to be stimulated by an electromagnetic environment that we know today is there because we can measure it using our modern scientific equipment. There is this wonderful, curious, and recurring statement in religious texts in which the stonemasons of those days were described as masters of making stone that speaks. So in other words, the stonemasons of those days were very important people. They considered the effects of rock whenever they were building their temples. In fact, they looked at rock as a living thing. It wasn't just a dead thing. And there's one example of how these stonemasons made the stones speak back in those days, and it exists in this form in Luxor, or just across the river from Luxor. And it's these two statues. It's all that's left of a very long processional avenue, which has just been rediscovered in the last couple of years. And these twin statues once framed the entrance of a complete avenue of stones leading to the temple of Amenhotep III. And from this wonderful drawing on the right here by, I believe it was Paul Roberts, a romantic from the Victorian era, but he totally captures the mood of those statues of what they used to look like back in the old days, because he got it absolutely right, that the statues are actually oriented to the rising sun at the equinox, that time when night and day are in perfect balance. And when these special moments happen during the year, and the Nile also began its flooding, the stones are described as emitting an audible hum. So in other words, the statues themselves would behave like tuning forks. Now, this is very particularly effective because as people were doing ceremony into the temple, you would walk past these statues at dawn, and you literally would be transfixed by this audible sound coming between the two statues. It freaked out the Roman invaders many thousands of years later to such a degree that the soldiers took sledgehammers to the actual statues and tried to break them apart because they couldn't understand this witchcraft. How could stones emit these wonderful sounds? Was it a kind of was it the gods coming back from the dead that were they going to sort of kill the Roman soldiers? They really were very afraid of these statues. They tried to destroy them. So you think about that for a second. When you're walking between these two statues in procession, you're preparing your body to walk into this temple. And what it's doing is you're getting this hum between the statues, and you are a series of resonances, and you're being stimulated by this. And at that moment, what also happens is that the spot in between the two statues, there is a vortex of energy that comes out of the earth at that particular spot. And this happens in many, many temples around the world. And again, it's measurable with modern equipment. So what you're doing at this point is that you are having not just your aural field stimulated, the electromagnetic field of your body is also being stimulated as you walk through. And again, this begins the process of entrancing. This is why doorways are called entrances. There's a very good reason for all this. And here's one very famous entrance. It is the entrance to the temple of Zozet at Saqqara, where we shall also be going to. And Saqqara is a wonderful name. It's the name is Sakra. It means sacred rock. And it's a very unique passageway. They're trying to rebuild it as best as they can. It's a wonderful colonnade of 18 reeds, each one of them separated by narrow alcoves. And the funny thing is that they look like reeds. The reed, of course, has always been a figurative association of sound. And, of course, the reed has always been used as a symbol of its vibratory effect on the natural rhythm of the human body. So the choice of style of these columns was very appropriate. Because when you walk down this canal of reeds at Saqqara, it's generating alternate polarities coming out of each alcove, as you can see from the diagram. This is something I measured years ago. You can literally douse it as you're actually walking down here. And you find the same effect happens at Newgrange in Ireland as well, and also in Chartres Cathedral as you're approaching the altar. You have an alternating field of positive and negative charge on approaching the great courtyard of the sacred space that you have to walk through. So in other words, this passageway excuse me, serves as both an invisible gate into the temple, while at the same time it influences your body's electromagnetic circuits. So when you go through these places, don't just walk in like a lemming. Do it deliberately, do it slowly, because these places are preparatory passageways. Because when you are suitably removing all of that negative thoughts that are accompanying you as you're approaching the temple, you are suitably entranced by the time you emerge into the sacred space, which in this case is the courtyard of the step pyramid at Saqqara. And this was very much the procedure that was required for dispelling negative thoughts and emotions, again, negative emotions, prior to entering the sacred abode. You had to get rid of all of this stuff before you went into the sacred temple. Anything that you were carrying was a frequency, okay? Your emotion was an energy. If you carried negative energy, you're carrying a negative frequency. It's like walking into a temple where everybody's playing Mozart and you're thinking of the Sex Pistols. The two just don't go together. They're two different frequencies. Not that they're right or wrong, or good and bad. They are just don't go together. So in fact, if you read the funerary texts that were inscribed at Saqqara, they actually have a very beautiful way of describing this process of entering the site. They call it the process of mastering oneself before crossing the threshold of each gate. So that's what they meant. All of these gates were there in place before you actually walked into Saqqara. So temple entrances are very important places because they define the passage from the material world into the body of a living God. It happens to be made out of stone. So these entrances are also traditionally located over energy vortices. If you've been to Stonehenge and you've come on our trips and you've gone past that initiatory process into the main temple, you feel a palpable energy difference between the outside and the inside of the temple. So it's still there. They are very, very there. And because these sacred places amplify the power of the intent you take into them, entering with an open heart is crucial for the process of initiation to be of any use. And when you go to Egypt, you'll see that on many entrances to the temples, the doorway is presided by the goddess Mat. There she is with her feather, reminding you that your heart should enter as light as a feather. That's why it's there. So in other words, you have to still your heart before entering the sacred abode. And stilling your heart helps you dispel all the chaos of the outside world. You know, because when you think about it, when you're chaotic, your heart is fluttering. You've got a frequency. So to still your heart and walk in, you are walking light as a feather. You enter the sacred space in a balanced state. I know there's a great pun here, and there's a reason for this. One of the people that came on one of my trips happened to make this sarcastic comment, "Oh, that's where the origin of doormat comes in." And they laughed for a bit, so we decided to do a resurrection ritual inside the chamber, and for some reason we seem to have forgotten to resurrect the guy. I think he's still there. So that'll teach him to be challenging to the gods. So, and also if you're from the American Southwest, you'll be familiar with this process of using a feather before you actually enter the sacred space. In the Native American traditions, they tend to sort of bring out incense before you enter the sacred abode, and they use a feather to move the incense around. So you see how these two cultures are totally separate, and yet they're totally connected, and they use exactly the same principle. So here we are in Luxor in the evening. Wonderful sight. One of my favorite all-round temples. To ease your body into this temple environment and to begin the process of initiation, the processional avenues themselves were also designed to stimulate and awaken each of the energy centers of the body. And you can see in this diagram how each of the energy chakras of the body corresponds to small vortices which you can actually find as you walk down the preparatory hallway into Luxor. You'll also notice how the base chakra on the left is misaligned with the entrance, but you'll also notice how the left part of the temple is misaligned to the rest of it. That's because Ramses II, who was a later pharaoh, also added this particular part of the temple to the original temple because by then his requirements were very, very different to the original purpose of Luxor. That's a whole story in itself. So this is why there's a slight misalignment there. But again, if you follow the trail of chakras all the way to the green chakra, which of course represents your heart chakra, that's the moment that you actually enter the great courtyard of Luxor. And of course, in order for you to proceed then into the altar, there's a reason why it's called the altar, of course. In order to proceed into those central initiation chambers, your heart again has to be open. So if you can't get your heart open, by the time you reach the great courtyard of Luxor, you basically turn back because the rest of the process will serve of no absolute purpose. Only the purer heart would proceed beyond this stage. And indeed, as you actually go into Luxor and to the altar section, which is the third eye chakra, if you actually get your cameras out there and you do a small prayer, you'll be rewarded with millions of anomalies on your camera, which some of you will call orbs and other names. But that's where you get all of those special effects. So there's a reason why this particular energy vortex is particularly profound at this particular site. Look at that pyramid. It's much bigger than that, I can guarantee you. So this was the, I should go back a little bit. As I mentioned before, these initiatory experiences, they were conducted from temple to temple. They slowly raised your comfort level from building to building. And the big prize was the Great Pyramid. And pyramids, they're no ordinary buildings. If you've been there, you'll understand what I'm saying. They may all seem similar. They don't feel similar because like every single temple in Egypt, they are designed as perfect images of nature. So they are mirror images of a creative force, of a god. And as such, they both exemplified and provided a foundation of moral rectitude for the initiates. In other words, temples serve as exemplary environments for initiation, which is very important, since the purpose of the shamanic experience was to remind the initiate he or she is a mirror image of nature. In other words, you are a mirror image of God. And this relationship between the temple and the teaching of the mysteries and their practice by the initiates formed a fundamental trinity that led to experience the rising from the dead. So not surprisingly, the temple had to be designed to influence the human body to become more sensitive and more receptive to subtle information. One causal factor was the temple's strategic placement on the landscape. And it's always been stated by so many of the architects of these buildings all around the world, wherever they actually inscribed their information, that the temples themselves were placed, and I quote, at carefully chosen locations. And it's always been a thorn on the side of alternative historians as to why these buildings were carefully placed at carefully chosen locations, and why not somewhere else. Well, nowadays, because we have access to very sensitive electromagnetic equipment, and specifically magnetometers, or if you happen to be a cheapskate like me, you use copper rods, you will find that every one of these temples, without exception, is always placed squarely at the intersecting points of the Earth's telluric currents. These are those snaking bands of energy that flow through the landscape, and whenever they intersect, a certain portal is created because of the interaction of electricity and magnetism, which does create a temporal space that differs from the space around it. So they're very carefully placed and very specifically placed. And to further amplify the effect of these natural laws, the temples were then designed to mirror other natural laws. And in Commonwealth, I describe this as the law of correspondence, because the temples literally do correspond to laws that exist in nature. And because the ultimate beneficiary was the human body, the buildings were also designed to correspond to the human temple itself. And here's a very good example, because you may not believe it, but what you're looking at here, my wonderful bent pyramid, which I adore, it literally is you looking at yourself in the mirror. Now, how cool is that? Did you believe for 1 second that you could actually look like a pyramid? Well, let me explain what's going on here. Diagrams are always good. It's always been a matter of some conjecture, especially among Orthodox archaeologists, that the the bent pyramid was a mistake. Now, I don't actually subscribe to the idea that the Egyptians ever did things by mistake. Everything was very, very calculated. And I never did believe that the bent pyramid was a mistake. And some clever spark, whose name I now cannot remember, unfortunately, this is what happens when you reach 50 years of age. Suddenly your brain starts to collapse one on top of the other. It is true. They actually worked out that those slope angles are very deliberate, because if you apply a very simple mathematical equation to those angles that the bent pyramid is bent at, you can actually reveal that the bottom angle reveals the shape of the hexagon, and the top part, when it's unfolded, reveals the shape of the pentagram. Now, you may wonder, what does the pentagram and the hexagram as geometry have to do with me being a mirror image of the bent pyramid? Well, here it is. Because the same geometry is also bound in the crystalline structure of human DNA. So all those little sugar crystals that make up who you are they also are made up of the same geometry that's inherent in the mathematical equation of the slope angle of the Great Pyramid. But that in turn mirrors the geometry of the Earth too. And here is how it works. To not go very deeply into numbers, because this is going to basically, I'm going to start watching all the numbers of people disappearing online. It is Sunday afterwards, unless you're in Australia and New Zealand, in which case, happy Monday. Those two geometries are inherent in the Earth because of this. If you take the Earth's wobble at the pole, it takes the Earth 25,920 years to complete that full wobble at the pole. Then you take that number and you divide it into the equator's ratio of 21,600 miles around the equator, and that ratio between those two numbers is a ratio of 5 to 6. So numerically, that is a metaphor of the pentagram, the 5-sided geometry figure, and the hexagram, the 6-pointed figure. So now you know why the bent pyramid is an analog of not just of the planet Earth, but also an analog of your DNA. So what I mean that when the bent pyramid is one of the most beautiful structures that totally harmonizes the meeting point between the Earth and you, now you know why. So it's very clever, very, very potent. But yet, when you look at the Great Pyramid, by contrast to the other pyramids, it uses a very different geometry, and thus it will elicit a totally different effect. And again, if you've been there, you will know that even just looking at the pyramid next to the Great Pyramid, I think it's Catherine's Pyramid, people, usually people who are into masculine energy, they love going into the Great Pyramid. But people who are into real feminine energy, they can't stand going in there. They want to go to the other pyramid. And that's the reason why. They may not know it and be appreciative of this, but the slopes of those two pyramids are different enough to elicit a very different effect. So what you're looking at here is the Great Pyramid, and its slope and its interior angles are built using the geometry of the heptagon. And it's the 7-sided figure, which is analogous to the music scale, the 7 notes of the do, re, mi, and also analogous to the 7 colors of the visible light spectrum. In other words, it is a mirror image of the causal forces of visible nature here on Earth. And when you go inside the Great Pyramid, the main subharmonic resonance of its chambers is 7.8 hertz. It's a very low frequency. It's infrasonic, but it just so happens to match the frequency of your brain when it's in a receptive state. And so what these acoustics inside the building are doing is they are responsible for inducing a shamanic environment. They're getting you to stop thinking, which when your thinking state, your brain goes up to about 11 hertz, all the way up to about 33 hertz. But in order to get you to feel rather than think, you have to start reducing your frequency down to 7 hertz and lower to get into that receptive state. Now, funny enough, that frequency inside the Great Pyramid just happens to correspond to the electrical field that resonates between the Earth and its ionosphere. Now, how did they know that? I would love to know. So that's one way that the Great Pyramid, again, harmonizes itself to you and gets you to be into that state. But there's more. Because if you look at the actual building, the way it's built, and you look at that dotted line on the diagram, it is designed to correspond to the human spine because the full force of energy of the Great Pyramid is right down the center. And when you're at the top of the Great Gallery or in the Queen's Chamber, you will feel like you're being oppressed. You can feel the whole weight of the building on top of you. You move sideways and the feeling subsides. And again, it's designed to mirror how your body feels like with the spine at its center. But yet, just like your heart is also offset to the left, the big initiation chamber, which is called the King's Chamber, is also offset slightly to the left. So once again, it shows how not just the building didn't just mirror you as a physical person. It shows that the preparation was necessary for entering the sacred space, and you had to open your heart to basically make the full effect. Otherwise, you're just a tourist running up and down the building, which is not really the purpose for going into the great buildings. So these resonant environments were basically designed to retune the body so it can experience something called religio. It is the art of reconnecting. You may know this word by another name today. It's called religion. Although, ironically enough, in the 20th century, religion is the one thing I've noticed on my travels that is the one thing that will not connect you to any other level of reality. It seems that it's been completely now misused, where you have to ask an intermediary to get you to religio, to your soul and to God. That's not what the ancestors were doing. You had a direct line between you and all creative sources. There was no intermediary necessary, unless it was a priest that was helping you understand how this works. And when you go to Abydos in Egypt, and if you happen to look up, right, I think these columns are about 30 feet tall. If you happen to be paying attention about 20 feet outside the main entrance, you'll see how at Abydos, there's this wonderful example of a temple that was used for out-of-body journeying as part of the resurrection rituals, during which the knowledge was received. Because at Abydos, one of the reasons that the initiates used this place was to go on out-of-body journeys. And the idea was to bring back information or gnosis. And whatever the gnosis you brought back really depended on what the question was that you posited before you went into the shamanic state. And in one of the corner of the columns, as you can see here, if you look very carefully, you'll see some hieroglyphs that just don't belong. And one of them is of a submarine, a helicopter, and what looks like a Second World War II American fighter plane, the Mustang. And there's also a tank there with a turret. Very unusual. And it was revealed to me that this was one of the things that the shamans actually viewed when they did forward progression into the 20th century. And they basically carved these hieroglyphs to show what they could actually see in the future and yet did not quite understand. So they put it there for us to show that you can do traveling in these places. And it pretty much explains why these unusual hieroglyphs are there. And it's certainly one of the best explanations I've heard. So for temples to influence the pilgrim, they also mirrored constellations. That was another level of the law of correspondence. And they drew upon the energetic properties associated with specific stars. There's a wonderful inscription to prove this, again, at the Temple of Edfu, at the Temple of Horus at Edfu, I should say, where it is described how before the foundation of the temple that you see now, the builder god Jehuti, that wonderful ibis-headed god, and here he is again, we make it a wonderful exception for the god Jehuti. I love this guy. It's probably the reason why I end up writing so much. I've got this god on my desk, the god of scribing. Maybe I should change the god to the god of massage or something. And so Jehuti actually talks about how he, along with his wife Seshat, originally created the foundation, which lies several stories behind the temple that you can see here, and how he first, in order to make the foundation of the temple true, he first had to look at the position of stars. So I quote, "I have grasped the stake. I take the measuring cord in the company of Seshat, his wife. I consider the progressive movements of the stars. My eye is fixed upon the bull's thigh," meaning Taurus, the constellation. "I count off time and establish the corners of the temple from there." Now that's a wonderful description of how at least 8,000 years ago, there's the god Jehuti actually sitting on the earth like you and I would do with some sticks, and they would mark off the heavens, figure out the appropriate connection to the stars, and when the moment was correct, they would stake out the corners of the temple, and from there, the temple rose. It's like a postcard that sort of travels through time. Same thing happens in Luxor as well. The ceremonial avenue was also aligned to the rising of Sirius, specifically during a certain time of the season when the star of knowledge and the star associated with gnosis and wisdom rose at a specific time of the year, just before sunrise, as the most prominent star of the horizon. And if you're standing at the right place at the right time, you can see it as the brightest object in the sky. And it's one reason why Luxor, along with many other temples that have the same alignment, are associated with ancient knowledge or gnosis. If you have never been to Egypt and can't afford to go there, You can also experience the same thing in Paris. Its main processional route down the Tuileries also is aligned to the rising of Sirius, and of course it was put there by the French Freemasons who borrowed this information from the Egyptians. And if you can't get over to Europe and you live in America, well, if you get down to Washington, D.C., Pennsylvania Avenue is also aligned to the rising of Sirius, as are the two mounds at Serpent Mound in Ohio, where I've just been. So you can basically look at all of this information and basically figure out that, you know, no matter where you are, it's not pertinent just to one country. You'll find this information again and again, no matter where you are. And there's a wonderful diagram, which I'm sure many of you know. Robert Bauval originally figured out the connection between the pyramid and the Sphinx and why they are there and when they were put there. Because the two temples are a wonderful example of multiple stellar correspondences. Through this, it was able to be proved, and I believe quite categorically, that the original site of the Sphinx and the Great Pyramids were really put there at 10,500 BC. It is a moment the Egyptians called Zep Tepi. It is a moment of the resurrection of Osiris. And at that particular moment, on the spring equinox, on 10,500 BC, the constellation of Orion is up in the sky, and its belt perfectly mirrors the location of the three original pyramids. And at that exact moment, on the horizon, the constellation of Leo is looking at its mirror image on the ground in the shape of the Sphinx, which back then, of course, resembled the head of a lion. The concept is then repeated yet again in 2500 BC, when another section was added to the pyramids that aligned to other stars and constellations important to the period, because the Earth, of course, during that time has shifted relative to the constellations as well. Excuse me. So what happened was that those shafts that you see in the outer casing of the pyramid now maintained a link between the earthly temple and its mirror in the heavens at that particular time. So by maintaining these associations throughout time, the rituals of resurrection in the Great Pyramid could still link the soul during the initiatory process on its journey to the stars 8,000 years after the original site was created. So you can appreciate how these things were conducted over the course of many, many millennia for the benefit of many people again and again. And this correspondence between the temple and the stars even lent its name to our study of the heavens, because the original name of Isis, the goddess of nature, and also the mother of the heavens, her original name was Ast. And of course, we get that wonderful name, astronomy, the study of the stars. So it's right there in front of you. We have all of these secrets of the Egyptian mysteries and the connection to the other world and the heavens right in front of us. And we also can begin to appreciate how the geodetic and the geometric correspondences in temples contribute to an environment that allows for the journey of the soul during the ritual of resurrection, when the initiate is said to become, and I quote, as a bright star. The whole process was to get you to have this out-of-body experience, so again, you can journey to the places where the gods exist. There they are again. They're everywhere, these little buggers. There's something very mischievous about them. I don't trust them. I just don't trust them. Beware of the meerkats and the sheep. Very important stuff. Sunday afternoon in Maine. You've got to be mischievous. So, there is a common story that is beginning to emerge here. And we have this whole resurrection of the initiate really coming across as nothing that was literal. It was a stylized death. And when you were raised from the chamber, you became a bright star on the morning horizon. That's what they were talking about. It wasn't a physical resurrection. It was a stylized resurrection. And if you read the Gnostic Gospels, many of which are actually published today, there's this wonderful treatise that exists on the resurrection. And in fact, it is actually called the Treatise on Resurrection. And in it is described how the ordinary human experience is referred to as a spiritual death, whereas the resurrection is regarded as the moment of enlightenment. And the ritual experience of rising from the dead is claimed to reveal what truly exists in the universe, not as you perceive it, but as it actually is. And it was said that whoever grasps this idea becomes spiritually alive, and they can be rescued from the dead immediately. You don't have to wait until you die. When you are totally aware of this experience of rising out of your body, and you are totally connected to the gnosis or the knowledge, then you have experienced that rising from the dead while you are awake. If any of you are into the film Dune, you'll know this phrase because they describe it as the sleeper has awoken. So there is this reference to this ancient gnosis even in Dune, as of course it is in Star Wars. And the same concept is even repeated in the Gnostic Gospel of Philip, which is a wonderful read, because in it, Philip actually ridicules how ignorant Christians, and he actually uses that word, how ignorant Christians who take the resurrection literally are very silly people. And again, this is his opinion, it's not mine. And I quote directly from the Gnostic Gospel of Philip: anyone who believes in resurrection as a literal truth is a fool. How about that? And then you read further along, Philip goes on to elucidate that, and I quote, those who say they will die first and then rise are in error. They must receive the resurrection while they live. And again, these people were much closer to the original teachings of the Essenes or the Essenes before, of course, the whole thing became indoctrinated into Orthodox Christian belief. And then there's this guy. This is Clement of Alexandria. Alexandria, back in those early days, was one of the last places where the knowledge was housed. You may be familiar with the Library of Alexandria, which one day was actually burnt down by some very fundamentalist Christians who they did not even like Gnostic Christians. Even back then, there were two types of Christians, and the Gnostic Christians did not meet a very happy ending. That's all I can tell you. And again, I wrote about all this in Commonwealth / the Divine Blueprint. So Clement of Alexandria was a very interesting learned scholar of the time, and he wrote this wonderful treatise, which was entitled, and I need a deep breath for this because it's a long title, The Mysteries of the Faith Not to be Divulged to All. And in it, he describes how the knowledge is not made available to everyone. And if I can quote one of the paragraphs from the letter, which you can actually see here on the right, and I tell you, I can validate that this is not an actual copy of it, I mean, not a physical copy. I don't have the original copy. He says in this letter, the wise do not utter with their mouth what they receive in counsel, but what you hear in the ear, says the Lord, proclaim upon the houses. Allow them to receive the secret traditions of the true knowledge and expound them aloft and conspicuously. And as we have heard in the ear, so to deliver them to whom it is requisite. But to all without distinction, in other words, non-initiates, what is said to them is parables. So clearly he is stating that true spiritual knowledge would be concealed and accepted as a literal truth by the uninformed, in other words, the dead, while the informed would discern more subtle and meaningful information from these parables. And this technique was particularly important in the early Christian era, when anyone who was indoctrinated into the mysteries was likely to be murdered, and in a very brutal way as well, a very ugly way. Even Gnostic Christians did not survive the pogroms of the Orthodox Christians. And it's a very, very sordid story indeed. So here we have a very similar situation when thousands of years earlier, the pharaohs who themselves received initiation were easily identified by a very important symbol. And again, if you go past the statue of Tutankhamun, it's right in front of you. The symbol of initiation is marked by the serpent and the vulture, strategically placed on the brow, or as I should mention, the third eye. And it symbolizes several things. For one thing, the serpent, of course, is a symbol of harnessing the earth energies, because we've always described the meandering earth energies or the telluric currents as serpent lines. It shows that the pharaoh has attained dominion over the lower human nature. That's why the serpent is risen, Okay, the serpent, as you know, slides along the ground. It's a metaphor for the fact that you are associating with purely physical impulses. But the serpent that rises up from the ground is spiritualized. It is now rising up and away from the material force of the ground. So because of the serpent's position on the pineal gland of the pharaoh's head, the pharaoh is shown to be spiritualized. He or she has been indoctrinated into the mysteries. Now the vulture is also very important because the vulture traditionally represents the transcendent aspect of the flesh-seeking man. Because a vulture in real life flies above the dead body, does it not? And that's a symbol for the fact that you have now discarded your dead body. You basically have reached a symbolic position where you can actually held the material urge back, and you've checked the material urge, and you've now spiritualized. You are now able to discern between the spirit and the material body in two very distinct ways. So it's not very dissimilar to the red ochre circle that is painted on the third eyebrow of Hindu practitioners as well, because it would almost be kind of silly to walk around every day with a serpent and a vulture on your forehead. I think that's my understanding of it. And as you can see, the meerkats also have their own particular sign here. They have a red tongue, which signifies that they too have been indoctrinated into the mysteries. Oh, those long days of autumn in Maine, what can I say? So, finally, I want to come full circle to the concept of the hero, which I mentioned at the beginning with the god Her-Ur, or Horus. He is the candidate who has undergone spiritual transfiguration through resurrection and risen from the journey into the other world as a bright star, awakened and aware of the bigger mysteries of the universe. And the original hero of the transfiguration of the soul, of course, is his father Osiris. And he's a man who basically shed his material connection with the body, resurrected as a bright star, and became like a god. He is essentially the very personification of the god man. And as the hero of his personal ritual, he basically comes to preside over the entrance to a place called Seket Yanu. It literally means paradise in Egyptian, or as they call it over there, it's called the field of reeds. So because Osiris has gone through this process of initiation, he's left the body, he's basically be able to come back and reach the stars. He has reached the place of paradise. And this is what the Templars were talking about, that they want to come into the joys of paradise through this secret initiation for which so many gave up their lives and would not reveal. They were following this Osirian concept. Now, the funny thing is that Osiris happens to share many similarities with another later hero called, yes, Jesus Christ. And my apologies for that wonderful pun, by the way. If any of you are into yes, you'll get it. Jesus Christ, of course. Jesus Christ. There's a reason why these puns keep coming up. Trust me on this one. But that song by Yes will never be the same. Jesus Christ, of course, is an invented name. It's a Greek name, and it literally means the Lord is salvation. Except that back in those days, the Lord literally was an association with a highest principle, or a principle of knowledge. And Christ, basically, as most of you will be familiar, is an archetypal name for someone who has been initiated into the mysteries. They have been Christed, they are risen from the dead. They have transmuted their animal nature, their base emotion, and they have Christed themselves into spiritual enlightenment. But if you read very carefully these Gnostic Gospels, Christ actually does not literally die on the cross. And there are some very good books written about this, because even the Quran mentions very categorically that Christ did not physically die on the cross. There's a wonderful body of evidence that suggests, in fact, and I've mentioned two books off the top of my head, The Hierarchy and Holy Blood, Holy Grail. And I do support the theories in those books because they're so well researched. The body of evidence seems to suggest that because Jesus was an initiate of the Essenes and also the Nazarene sects, Jesus underwent a symbolic death and then rose from the dead. So in other words, he's the hero who figuratively was murdered only to later rise from the dead. interestingly, it's very similar to the path that is taken by Osiris. So I always wondered, is Osiris and Jesus, are they the same guy or the same concept at least? Well, follow me on this very bizarre etymological journey, and you really are going to have to focus on this one. Well, Jesus we know is real. He appears in 3 BC. However, the same myth of Jesus just happens to appear in 2000 BC, where there's this Celtic man-god called Esus, who was born of a virgin, was a healer god, and was then crucified and gets up later. In Nigeria, at the same time, he is also a guy called Eshu, gets nailed to a cross, gets up 3 days later. And that's not all. In Tibet, there's a guy called Gesar, who is an ancient savior god who also is resurrected. And not to outdo all those people, the Navajo call him Yesha, who in about 2000 BC does exactly the same thing. If you happen to be in Georgia, not the country, but the state, he is a guy called Ezagate. Well, a favorite term of Jesus, he used to say, yes, one of the favorite phrases associated with Jesus was, "I am the light." Well, oddly enough, in Vedic scriptures in 800 BC, there is this Vedic scripture called the Isa Upanishad, and it focuses on the attainment of the self, or being. It basically describes a person at one with the divine, or in modern language, it is the I am. So we have here the same metaphor in 800 BC, different era in Jesus Christ's time. But it is Jesus' original Greek name that gives away the whole game, because his name in Greek is Jesus. It literally means God-man, and that is the same epitaph as Osiris. Let's see where this story now goes. Aha! Now, this idea of an earthly being who is made divine was perverted into the god-hero titles of Caesar and Kaiser and Tsar. Now, however, in Latin, the letter C could also be pronounced softly as a G. So Caesar was also pronounced Giza. This title is actually found in Mongolia in 2500 BC as the Gisar Khan, in other words, King Gizar. And it does again in the Basque language of northern Spain. It's one of the most ancient of languages. It has no origin that we know of. And there you will find a Giza, who is the man who came. Now, figure that one out. So, who is this guy, Jesus? Because it's getting very, very mysterious. Well, Jesus in phonetic Arabic is Isha. And he has no Hebrew etymology or source, so it precedes Hebrew, which means that this name Isha is a very, very ancient name. Egyptian tradition places great importance on the concept of as above and below. Therefore, when you're expressing divinity on earth in linguistic terms, the letter G has to be prefixed to your name. In other words, Geb, Lord of the Earth, or Gaia, the name of Mother Earth. So the name Isha is made divine by adding a G, and it becomes Gisha, which in phonetic Arabic reduces to Giza, meaning embodiment of the place of Isis. We know this name very well because it is Giza, or the Giza Plateau. Aha, now it gets very interesting. In modern Egyptian, Giza means proximity, which implies that the pyramids on this plateau are the buildings near to God. And it reveals that they are places of reconnecting with the spirit, with the source. And thus, the temples of initiation where flesh meets the spirit. Makes a lot of sense. So Giza is the location of the Great Pyramid, otherwise known as the House of Osiris, where the God-man finds enlightenment and thus was said to have risen from the dead. Gets very, very interesting. But wait, there's more. I told you it was going to be difficult. That's why I have a lot of diagrams. Let's take a look at this guy, Osiris. Now, Osiris is a Greek name. It's a translation of the original Greek name, which is Asar. Now, Asar is the son of the Lord of the Earth, Geb. So therefore, you have to earth this name by adding a G. So Asar becomes Gasar, also known as Gisa. Giza is also spelled Gesa or Gesu, meaning a prince of the earth. So at Giza, we have a place of transfiguration where a human being undergoes an alchemical transfiguration and becomes like a god. So the initiate, in other words, is spiritualized. He or she has risen from the dead and is no longer subordinate to material forces. Literally, you have become a prince of the earth. And so it is that Osiris, Jesus, and Giza are perhaps one and the same concept. So this gives me a lot of appreciation for people in the modern Western concept that they are suddenly born-again Christians. You know, I don't think I'm ever going to laugh at them because there may be a kernel of truth to all of this, you know. It is quite fascinating to see how this linguistic connection does have a lot and hold a lot of knowledge and truth to it. So all this thing about born again, absolutely true. So to try and sort of wrap all of this up, there's a reason why all these puns keep coming up. You see, the Egyptians, as far as I'm aware from some of my colleagues, they came up with the pun. They never trusted words because they felt that sound carries everything. Sound is a material carrier wave of truth, and you have to resort to words, then you've already started the process of lying. So in order to take down the importance of words, they came up with the idea of puns. So that's why I'm putting up all of these puns. So I apologize for all of these cringe-inducing moments, but hopefully, and because we're not in a live environment, I don't know if you're taking them seriously or not. Hopefully there's a lot of laughing out there. And even better, it's even funnier if in English they also translate in different languages. So what I've tried to paint here is how the ritual of raising the dead echoes pretty much from ancient times into our time. And you can even still recognize these concepts about raising the dead at a time called Easter, which is essentially a religious event marking the pivotal time of death and rebirth of the spiritualized human, now characterized, of course, in Christianity by the resurrection of Jesus. And yet the etymological roots of Easter also lie with Isis, because her name in ancient Egyptian is Ast, eventually becomes Astarte in Phoenician, and eventually it evolves into the Hebrew Esther, meaning a morning star, which, as we saw earlier, equates with the Egyptian ideal of the reborn soul upon the culmination of the ritual of resurrection at dawn. Aha! So the prelude to Easter, of course, is Palm Sunday, which marks Jesus' triumphant entry into Jerusalem riding a donkey or an ass. And again, this event is full of esoteric symbolism because a man who has overcome his animal nature, and I mean that without basis of man or woman, it's just symbolic. The person who has overcome their animal nature has achieved this by undergoing a figurative death. His followers, when he walked into Jerusalem, marked this deeply symbolic rite of passage by waving palm leaves. However, this gesture actually harks back to the myth of Osiris, the epitome of the cult of raising the dead. And here we are, yet again, back onto Osiris. Because the resurrection myth of featuring Osiris and his consort Isis is the central pillar of the Egyptian mystery schools. And Osiris basically ruled the kingdom until his jealous brother Set cut him up into little pieces and unceremoniously dispersed them into the Nile. And because Osiris produced no heir, Isis was left with no son to dispose of the evil brother Set. So in effect, she was a divine virgin presiding over a kingdom gone to ruin. So Isis gathers up her husband's body parts, magically reassembles them, and after making him a new phallus made of gold, Osiris is resurrected and Isis is impregnated. And after his ordeal, Osiris shines forever as a bright star and returns to restore life to a land that has become barren. And the symbol that was used to depict the resurrected Osiris is the palm tree. So now you see the connection that follows all the way through from early Egyptian culture all the way to the time of Jesus' symbolic triumphant return to Jerusalem. And you'll notice all the time how Osiris is depicted with green skin. Well, there's a very good reason for that, because he is the oldest expression of the cult of the green man. He is essentially the tutelary deity of fertility, who every year at the spring equinox and coincidentally at the time of Easter revitalizes the land and raises it from the dead. And so it is that every Easter we are symbolically celebrating the rebirth of a Christed element, not just within the earth, but also within ourselves. So just like the cycle of seasons, the knowledge of these mysteries survive in one form or another thanks to their rediscovery by the Knights Templar, who gave life to the secrets of resurrection hidden by the Essenes in vaults beneath Jerusalem. And then they applied them in their initiation rituals in secret underground chambers throughout Europe. It's exactly as the Templars who were tortured by the Inquisition stated. Their entry ritual, they said, "I wish to come into the joys of paradise." So I put all of this information about the resurrection practices of the Templars in the new book, First Templar Nation, if you want to follow that. And as for the Templar ritual of resurrection, it actually survives today, figuratively, in the third degree of speculative Freemasonry, whose origin, of course, is traced back to the mystery school of Pharaoh Sequanenretau, who we met earlier on this tour. And back then, if you actually were into the mysteries and you were initiated and you were able to go through these wonderful years of initiation and you learned the gnosis, you'd be made a master of the craft, exactly as the speculative Masons are called today. And back in the medieval era, if you're also a Templar, you were described as a cunning person. And back then, cunning, or the word kyning, would you believe, meant knowing special esoteric knowledge. So if someone calls you a cunning person to your face, you can say, "Thank you. Yes, I am a person who knows special esoteric knowledge." And so the cycle repeats again forever and ever. Amun. Not bad way to end that, is it? So it's a big journey. And again, if you want to follow this journey, and I always give you a little tidbit of the big truth, that book Commonwealth, which many of you probably have, is now called the Divine Blueprint. It's a long story. Don't ask me. And I go much more into the raising of the dead with the Templars in the book that just came out last week, which I'm very proud of. 15 years of work. So a lot of it's in there. Take a look at it on the website. It'll be there for hours. And I guess, Robin, if anybody still has any questions before I stop sounding like Barry White and get all these proposals of marriage, I can take a few questions.
Okay, well, we do have a few questions. And the first one is from Dawn, or Tish McNamara, who you'll remember.
Oh, no,
and
not her.
Yeah. So I'm going to see if I can enable her microphone so she can ask them. And there she is.
Hello. Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, wow. Okay.
You're in profile, so you must be in the witness protection program.
Oh, I don't have a video now.
No, you're in profile. There's a dark outline of you.
Oh, it's that way. Yeah, dark feminine.
So the last two didn't work then. You better come on the next one then.
So, Robin, what were my questions? I forgot now.
Okay. You asked.
Sakara, right?
Yeah. So, yeah, the first one. Well, the first one was on Dendra, and it was, what are the translations of the hieroglyphic labels over each of the vacuum tubes in the initiation scene from Dendara?
Yeah.
I'd love to know. I haven't found yet any source that actually talks about it. So
Okay.
yours is as good as mine at this moment.
All right.
Dig a little bit deeper. And I mean, when a lot of these, I got most of my information from a scientist. She's a doctor in Manchester University in England. She wrote a very dry but brilliant book on some of the transcriptions from the pyramid text and the building text. And I didn't find any reference in there. So she may be, oh no, she's passed away. So it may be that the same university may actually be working on it and it hasn't been deciphered yet or hasn't been published. So it's a good point, actually. I'll keep my eye out for that one.
Yeah. Saqqara in the reconstruction, my assumption is going to be, but it's also a question, while they're reconstructing, are they paying any attention anywhere near the original construction, which was the type of media, the crystalline structure, the paramagnetic quantity and quality, the polarity, the orientation? I mean, all of that added to the tonality and the changes that happen as you go up that passage, through that passage, and into each cubicle, right?
Yeah.
When they're doing the reconstruction like they do at the Parthenon and everywhere else, they use crap materials, you know, with no attention even to the media, never mind crystalline arrangement.
Marble, concrete.
Yeah. Well, at least it's marble. It could be worse.
It's a good point. The one that was being erected on top of the original site in Dendra was built by the Ptolemies, and they actually knew that the people that were close to Alexander the Great, from where the Ptolemies come from, the dynasty, they actually knew this stuff. And I've been to Dendra several times, and the resonance is good. I mean, I like it there, and I think they made a very good effort of actually trying to put a temple along the same principles of the one that was there before. So it is good. I do get a good vibe in there, and I think they were doing the right thing.
But you said Dendra, and this was Saqqara that you were talking about earlier being reconstructed.
Oh, wait, I thought we were talking about Dendra.
Saqqara.
Oh, Saqqara. Well, Saqqara, the passageway, it's still, the reeds had been put back because the columns were brought down through earthquakes and so forth. The energy field is still there. It's measurable. The actual energy of the temple is actually at the Great Pyramid and also the Pyramid of Unas, which of course is now restricted access because it's the buildings are falling apart literally on top of your head. So I have no way of actually measuring inside, but outside I can tell you I've done a whole survey of Saqqara, and yes, the energy is still going into the building. And the energy is still coming down that passageway through the reeds, so it is still there. It's still palpable, mostly because I don't think anybody thought about changing it in the first place. And actually, it brings up a bigger question, because I actually thought about this when I was learning how to work with energy years ago. And I thought, well, if the temple is being partially destroyed or it's fallen down because of decay, is the original energy still there? And because the signs were so profound, the older the temple gets, because the signs are so profound and the intent so focused, and so many people like us who go to these temples, they add a little bit every time we go there. The temple maintains its connection to the original purpose. So these places are still working. I have to go to places like Glastonbury to find examples of where the temples have been slightly disconnected by people who go there to work with them for the wrong reasons. And then people like groups like myself go there and paint the energy back in again. So there is a yin and yang going on. Some of the Gothic cathedrals have lost their connection because they're built on old chambers, but because of the overlying religious belief of the people who take care of them, the building has got into disuse, and therefore its original energy is much more diluted. So it's sort of a yes and no answer to the question. It depends which temple you're at. But in Saqqara, definitely, it's still there in the passageway for sure.
Wonderful, thank you. We've got several more questions. We've got a couple from Norma Lee, and yes, her microphone's not working, so I'm going to ask for her. The first one, is it dangerous to go to the temples if one is not pure of heart or does not know how to still one's heart?
I don't think it's dangerous. I just think it lessens the effect and the connection. I think you'd have to go in there deliberately with feeling out of balance and going in there and doing meditation. I think it will start to multiply all your negativity. It's like a bad trip. When I hear people doing ayahuasca, if they're not in a perfectly balanced state, you're going to start doing a lot of very bizarre imagery. And I think it will work the same way, because the idea is that you go there with a certain thing in mind. You go there with a certain intent, and you're very focused. So if you go there unbalanced and you're heavy of heart, and you're taking all this stuff with you, then the temple's going to go and say, well, okay, well, I'm going to show you where this leads to its natural culmination. And you might just have sort of a negative experience, or at least a dark experience, because it's trying to show you an answer to your question that you're giving the temple. So it is possible, but you'd have to be very conscious of it and very deliberate of it. I think if you just walk in there feeling upset or something and just walk in like a tourist, because you're not totally open to it, you might not even be aware of it. You might just sort of get a headache out of it. Or at the very least, you might just feel like you don't want to be there, and the temple will tell you to go away. And that used to happen to me a lot when I was first learning how to do this. There'll be places that I'd go, and I was just kind of in a mood that I wasn't really focusing. My girlfriend sort of left me or something, and I go in, and I was there for 10 seconds, and I felt like someone was shoving me out of there with an invisible hand. And now I understood why. So yeah, it is possible to attract that if you're definitely thinking about it.
Okay, great. Her next question is, could the pyramids even be older than 10,450 years ago, built on even older temples? And where did the Egyptians get the basis for their alchemistries, even older civilizations?
Oh, absolutely. If you read the Egyptian pyramid text and the building text, it tells you about the time before a great catastrophe overwhelmed the earth. And I go into this in the Divine Blueprint in huge detail, because it shows very clearly that there was a group of race called the Builder Gods that survived the Great Flood of 9000 BC. And before them, there were the Creator Gods, the very tall people with the big knowledge. And even they had inherited their information from other academies that also went under the ocean. They went back into times that even they forgot. So what we're seeing today, basically, are the rebuilds of older structures, and it is now very well established that the three main pyramids on Giza are built on an outer layer that represents the stars of 2500 BC. There is an inner layer which Beauval made a very good argument for placing at 10,500, and below that you've got the well, you've got the underground chambers. So you have definitely layers upon layers upon layers, and even if you just follow the building text suggestion that no temple could be deemed sacred unless it was built on the foundation of at least 16 other temples, then yes, you are talking about things that go on and perpetuate themselves forever and ever and ever, beyond an incalculable range.
Great. Thank you. We now have some questions from Professor Paul de Virville, and he's got a microphone. Yes. So I'm going to enable his microphone, and there you go, Paul.
Hello, Freddy. Can you hear me, Freddy?
I can hear you.
Good. Yeah, we had met a long time ago with John Michel in Salisbury.
Yeah, that was a happy occasion.
Yes, yes. Question in terms of several questions. One in terms of the role of dreams in this initiation process. It seems like you're tapping into the archetypal unconscious, and since it is over many different cultural levels, I'm curious of your take as well as your experience in terms of what's going on in the unconscious dream world. That's my first question.
The way that I've come to understand it is it's very much dependent. The imagery and the answer and the knowledge that you receive from these experiences is very much portrayed and framed by your frame of mind, your mood, and also how you consciously frame a question as you're walking into the actual temple, just like you're doing with me now, and you're getting back an answer that is hopefully relative to what you're asking me. And it seems because the temples were such mirrors of people and of nature, they behave in the same way. So the more focused you were on a specific notion, then the more that dream or that subconscious shapes itself to reveal the information back to you as an answer relative to what you pose to it. And that makes a lot of sense to me. That's from personal experience and from shared experiences, it seems to make a lot of sense to all of us,
Yeah, so that it's actually the unconscious or a deeper source of wisdom that is creating the imagery. You're not actually making it up as you go along.
Absolutely.
Yeah, what about, in terms of temporary temples, or in terms of other places besides the Great Pyramids or the crop circles, I mean, and there was a major crop circle. I don't know, did you see it, that just happened in the Hopewell Mounds near Chillicothe last week?
And quite possibly the only real one of 2012.
Well, no, this one, Jeff Wilson, you know Jeff.
Oh, I know him very well. Lovely man.
Yeah, and they just did major research. I mean, it's on earthfiles.com, the report, the full report. I mean, it looks, it's in core. Anyway, that seems to be,
Ohio. Yeah, it's very
yeah,
good.
in Ohio.
I like it. I like it.
Yeah, in the mound building. It's about 25 miles from the Great Serpent Mound. But that just happened recently. But again, that's, what are the again, you mentioned these Telluric sites where there are other temples, so to speak, or these times and places that can be connected besides the pyramid. Other places in the United States, where would you see those?
Well, the crop circles are the same thing. They're fulfilling the same function, which is why I've always been adamant that it's very important to differentiate the real ones from the hoaxes, and why I get into so much trouble with the, I'll put that in inverted commas, the research facility, groups, because there aren't really that any left apart from Jeff Wilson's group. We're either sort of dead or retired. But they're fulfilling exactly the same function. This is why people have also out-of-body experiences in the real crop circles as well. And sometimes I've been with German researchers where we've actually bought a piece of the land, made our own crop circle with full knowledge of the farmer, and tried to imitate the shamanic process by using our intent to create a deliberately man-made crop circle for the process of connecting. And I can tell you, you can do it. You can actually vector in the energy to those man-made designs and create the same process at work at any temple. And that's why I began to really teach this stuff, because I said, well, that's what they're here to teach us. They're getting us to teach us to build our own temples because we've forgotten how to do it. And that's why it's so important. And that's why I get so emotional about arguments about crop circles and people saying that it's all real. No, it's not. Some of them are fake. And you've got to differentiate one from the other. So in America, it's interesting that we're getting so many real ones, and also, again, next to the ancient mounds, because they're trying to make sure that that connection exists. So in America, North America, it's a little bit more difficult because our friends here were so connected to the land, like the Aboriginal cultures, that they hardly built anything because they could see it. They could see the energy. They know where it happens. They know where the vortices are. They were just walking to the temple. So for them, it was basically creating a sacred circle with people because they didn't need to build it. They moved from one state to the other as they needed to, and they would find the energy wherever it happened to be. So for us today, it makes it a little bit more difficult. We'd have to go to Ohio, Louisiana, places in the Midwest and in the Appalachia where those mounds are, because 9 times out of 10, they will also form the focus of intersecting lines of energy. And I have been to the ones in Ohio a lot and found that the same principle happens there. Where you have a Native American mound, you also will have the intersecting lines of magnetic energy, and that's why you do your shamanic state there. And if you talk to the Cherokee, who inherited so many of their stories from and the myths from a culture that they met on their trek across America, they found this old culture called the Alawane living in the Appalachia. They were very tall beings. They said that they escaped a sinking island to an ocean to the east. And by the time the Cherokee met them, they were already very brutish. They were interbreeding because they couldn't interbreed with normal people because they were, 12 feet tall, 9 feet, 12 feet tall. And they were the ones that were responsible for those mounds. So you could say in a way that these were the ancient Egyptians of the American culture, that the Cherokee then maintained a tradition of mound building to the same principles. So that's why you'd find them in North America, where the mounds are. And apart from that, you'd have to look into local culture and find out where the natives used to do their ceremonies. Guaranteed that's where the hot spots will be.
Yeah, that's an intentional incubation in a sense. But the fellow, it was Bear Cloud who did the stuff on the bent pyramid. Bear Cloud from Sedona.
He did anything on the bent pyramid? That's a
Yeah,
surprise.
yeah, he did the angles on that. But anyways,
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you much.
Great.
Yeah, the reference that I got was actually from someone, some other guy, and I'm trying to remember who his name was. It's in the Divine Blueprint, the actual reference. So I don't know if Bear Cloud got it from him as well. Don't know.
Okay, great, thank you. We have another question from Johnny Alm, and he's got a microphone, so I'm gonna, there we go.
Yes.
Johnny.
Okay,
Yeah.
too. I know all you guys.
Okay. This is Johnny. I'm speaking from Sweden.
Hello.
Hi, Freddy. Thank you for the lecture. It was very good.
Thank you.
Yes, and I've got a question regarding the 12th meridian, where we find the Vatican. Kahneman has been a lot into the 12th in his books, as where the world tree is dividing the Earth into two hemispheres. And he has done a lot of historical research regarding the 12th meridian. Do you have any theory regarding the 12th meridian?
I don't actually. That's not something I sort of go into. But I can tell you that when I was looking into the world grid system, following on from the work of Graham Hancock, I found out that the actual position of the Vatican, which I don't know if you're aware of this, the St. Peter's Square, where the obelisk is today, which they happen to have borrowed from Egypt. Well, okay, they stole it from Egypt. The original site was an ancient mound, and it had a standing stone on there. So the Vatican itself is built on an original sacred site, and it happens to be on a meridian, which is related to the grid, to the longitudinal grid of the Earth. And for those of you who are not familiar with the term, there are lines of latitude which go around horizontally across the face of the Earth, and there are lines of longitude which go north to south. And if you, I was positing that if the temples are built according to the law of correspondence, that they would be built and positioned in major places where the geometry of the Earth would be there numerically. So if you follow the logic that the Earth is a living organism, and therefore the appropriate geometry of the Earth would be the pentagram, because the pentagonal crystal so underlies every single living organism on the face of the Earth. If you take the angles which are inherent only in the pentagram and you use those numerical values as longitudes, one of them hits exactly, the first one west of Heliopolis, which is ground zero, the original city of knowledge in Egypt. The first longitudinal line to the west of Heliopolis is the Vatican, and that makes a lot of sense. So it shows that the deliberate positioning of the seat of the Catholic Church wasn't by accident. There's a deliberate alignment to this world grid. So, but as far as to the relationship to the 12, I'm not familiar with that one, but I know that it definitely is part of a grid.
Okay, thank you. Well, I birthed in the 12th meridian. I have my summer house in the 12th meridian and living in 12th meridian, and there is a lot of resonance within me regarding the Vatican and the 12th meridian. That's why I'm asking.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
so maybe I will.
That one. You're ahead of the curve on me on that one.
Okay, maybe I will.
Similar thing. It's like when I was talking to Graham Hancock about this, because when I came across this, I actually remembered that he had actually done something very similar. He hadn't actually put the Vatican on the grid. And we were just talking about it, and I said, it seems as if we're actually approaching the same result from different points of view, because he was also basing his work on someone else's idea that there was this world grid based on numerical values found in myth. So it sounds like a very same thing that I'm doing, that Graham's doing, that Giorgio de Santillana and Barbara von Deckend are doing. We're just calling it by different things.
Thank you. We've got two more questions, and neither of them have microphones, so I'm going to ask. One is from Franklin Lavoie, and he asks, did the ancient Egyptians associate Hermes with the planet Mercury, and is Jehudi Mercury? And he'd be curious to know what you think about Mercury in terms of its proximity to the sun, because it's difficult to spot, etc.
My God. I don't know. I'm not an astronomer. I wouldn't know. I've never seen any reference to Mercury and Jehuti. I have always seen him reference to the morning light and the Venus or Sirius, because it's reference to ancient wisdom. And Jehuti, of course, was the wisdom keeper of the gods. The first time I come across that is in Greek times, where Jehuti becomes Thoth, becomes Hermes, and that's when it is associated with Mercury. That's the earliest reference I can find, but certainly never found one in Egyptian culture, no. As to the other answer, I have no idea. You have to ask an astronomer.
Okay, great. And then our last question is from Elsie, and she wants to know about the role of women as initiates in the process of being initiated into becoming enlightened. If you could speak about that.
Oh, they're all equally involved. We seem to sort of, our understanding is that today is that it was mostly a male thing, simply because our Western viewpoint has been so dominated by a patriarchal culture, religiously speaking. But you had Hatshepsut in Egypt, who also was a priestess. Her temple, if you do the law of correspondence, it was a line southeast, and any temple aligned southeast, excuse me, is always associated with birthing, with the bringing of the light back into the earth. So there were initiation ceremonies there to do with sacred sexuality, creativity. And if you go to that temple, you would definitely get a sense that there was something very important being conducted there. So the women were certainly very part of it too. It wasn't just the guys. Everybody was totally involved, as long as they went past a year's initiation into the inner temple, which meant that you could be trusted with the information and you were a person of good moral character. And it applied to everybody. The change sort of begins to go into a patriarchal time around the time of the Hyksos period, which is when the tribes called the Hebrew, who became the Hebrews, came out of the desert, and they basically took over and ransacked Egypt. And this is historical fact, by the way. And basically Egyptian culture falls apart, and then only after, at the end of that, with the rise of Alexander, does the temple culture come back to the divine feminine again. So you see the seesaw going downhill by the time the Hyksos period in Egypt comes around. Goes up again with Alexander, and then it goes down again towards the Roman domination, back into the patriarchal. But certainly it went both ways. Both females and males were involved.
Great, thank you. Freddy, this has been amazing. And I can tell from the comments in the chat that, everyone has just really enjoyed it so much. It's like the information is, my mind is spinning.
They trip to Egypt, don't they?
They do. It's going to be incredible.
Yeah, so if you're still with us, Robin, Nye, and Mohammed, and some other fellow whose name I don't recall, will be going to Egypt in January. So if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, it's a good time to get warm. And I was just having a lunch with Mohammed in Virginia Beach, of all places. And I said, my reading of the media, and I spent a lot of years in the media to know this, is that there really isn't much trouble in Egypt. And I said, absolutely. There's a couple of little spots where there's always a little bit of trouble. But, you've got a better chance of being shot in Detroit than you have in Egypt. It's a great time to come because hardly anybody's there. And the chances of having the temples to yourself, as you'll know, is very rare in Egypt. You have to spend years doing Photoshop, removing all those tourists out of the pictures. And now is a good time to come. So consider it.
I'm looking forward to it. So thank you again for being here. And so if people want to get your new book on the Templars, for all your books, okay, let's do that.
I've got a slide for that. Yes, please. I've got to pay the rent. Yeah, First Templar Nation is the new book. It's the one thing that has never been written about the Templars, their greatest achievement, and I am not overselling it, believe me. And the Divine Blueprint is the reprint of a book called Commonwealth. Again, because most people thought the book was to do with Virginia. Go figure. So I've just recalled it something else, but it's the same book, and that has a fair bit of what I discussed today. And then there's all these DVDs as well. So all of this will keep you very happy throughout the whole winter. And as far as I can tell, nobody ever wants to sell the Divine Blueprint. They lend it to people and they never get it back. So I'm very flattered by that.
So it just means they need to buy a lot of copies so they can share them around.
Exactly, and actually people do that. It's very flattering, I have to say.
Yeah. All right. Well, yes. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Thank you.